Hey there, students. Welcome back to the School of Tomorrow. I'm continuing on the theme of that you can bury a lot of code and you still use it on the front end. So for example, under literature, as you know, in order to make sense of the 20th century, at least in American history, it requires you need to study the life and times of Bucky Fuller, right? And saying that, he was big on domes is true. And this dome in Afghanistan, for example, it really excited the Russians. You can read stories about these domes, and they were politically important, not just strategically in the sense of providing shelter. They also provided a vision of the future, and that was what Fuller was especially good at, is visioning a positive future. We don't get a lot of that in the movies. We don't get a lot of that in TV. So this was a big, important writer and poet because he had a positive vision of the future. And at some point, after he died or close thereto, people seemed to decide they'd rather not follow this thread and instead chose to where Jimmy Carter now explains to us that we're no longer in a democracy. It's an oligarchy with unlimited bribery is legal. So that's what former presidents say. Now, here in the math researchers, you might think, okay, so if we have to understand this math in order to understand history, then clearly the history and literature teachers are going to have to take it on, at least, if not the math teachers. Because math teachers, they're very conservative, and if it wasn't taught in like the 1800s, it might not make it into the curriculum. Now, that's not a justification. I'm just saying you're not under such restrictions if you're a history teacher. So then you can get into what the A and B modules are, which I've just brought over here from grunch.net. These are by Richard Hawkins. They're from quite a long time ago. That website's been up since the 90s, right? So we're talking well over 20 years that this information has not been taught in the mathematics curriculum. So I write to this guy. He's asking, I need help, guys. I'm preparing a presentation on current issues in mathematics education, so I'd like to have the opinion of all the researchers here. What would you consider the hottest issue topics in mathematics education? Can be a topic of research too. Thank you. So I end up down at the bottom here. I'm like, there's a lot of replies. And I'm like, the whole number volumes meme. Polyhedrons measured in unit tetrahedrons, core to 20th century literature, American literature. In case you're curious, American history and literature teachers have to cover the Buckminster Fuller chapter to make sense of the 20th century. He built his philosophy around an alternative approach to polyhedron volumes. Scroll down in literature above in the Above Jupiter notebook to see what all Americans, at least, need to know if serious about their citizenship. Now that's in a way just being sarcastic, I guess, because we all know in the 30 years or so that this material has been available for teaching in history, in literature, that mostly it's just bleeped over. Nobody knows about this volumes table. So the ball got dropped in most circles, you could say, including math circles. But we still have our World Game Museum where we look back on this period and talk about, so why did people choose to not explore this thread and take it further? That is interesting history. Now, where we're actually concentrating, since that's not going to go anywhere, the math culture is pretty much rigor mortis on this particular issue. We've got the underground comic book culture. And so this is where we can go kind of retro. We can go remember back to when this future was seeming possible, not just talking about domes here. I'm talking about the whole Dymaxion house thing, the whole idea of a positive future. that we can go back to and treat it kind of retro in the underground comic tradition and learn our math at the same time. So here's my Koski identities, and what's not clear from, I can get to it later, but what's not obvious when we look at the Jupyter notebook, right? All we see is the volumes table, the end results with all the whole number volumes. They're not all whole number, right? 20, 6, 5, 4, 3, 1, and then there's fractions like 2.5 and 1 over 24 and stuff like that. It's rationalized, it's streamlined, and it's history and literature. Whether or not you consider it worthy of math treatment, I think so. But we can just work with history and literature teachers for now. And so I've got the Koski identities in the background. And if you run this thing from the command line, like by hitting the run button, it actually triggers a print table function, which is at the bottom here, and it only runs if you run this top level. If you just import it, what it does is it creates a pandas data frame, this is what's new, and fills it in with comments included. Both does the math for the Koski identities and adds the comments. So that's where we're getting our comments in this Jupyter Notebooks table. But again, all we do is say import identities, import the volumes table. We could just get rid of import identities actually, and then show us the volumes table, and there it is. So all that computation and so on that takes place behind the scenes, we don't have to bring that code in. And that was my theme in a recent video as well, that the process for using Jupyter Notebooks is not about avoiding writing long code, it's burying the long code where people don't have to rub their noses in it and using the results of the long code. By long code, I mean like what we used to call computer programs, because in the Jupyter Notebook world, we're mostly interested in sharing small snippets of code. But that could reach into a machine learning environment, in just a few lines of code, you can actually do quite a bit, right? Because behind the scenes, you've got the big code, you've got the deep code, you've got TensorFlow or whatever. So in this case, I'm just role modeling that approach where we bury a lot of the code. Okay, so join me if you like in YouTube world in sharing some American history and literature. Our so-called citizens haven't got a clue actually. And if you're overseas, remember, you can talk about how oppressed Americans are because they don't even get their own history in school, which I think is the sure sign of an illegitimate sort of, I don't know, a totalitarian sort of pall has descended across America and turned us into a kind of zombies. And, we play party politics. We blame the Democrats blame the Republicans. It's party politics. I'll end on that note, like what I was saying about Jimmy Carter and his observation that we don't live in a democracy. This is a former president, by the way. And, he's pretty old now, so you can remember. But he's saying U.S. is an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery. So if you're fighting for America at all, like you think you're in the military, what are you doing around the whole number volumes? Anything? Do you go to West Point? Or are you just like doing what they tell you when you go act like a mercenary? Because ask yourself, who's in control? Is it the United States? Everyone's blaming the U.S. for everything. But if the U.S. is disappeared, it's an oligarchy, then stop blaming the U.S., really. Can't have it both ways. Either the U.S. is a totalitarian oligarchy, in which case it's not the U.S., not the constitutional U.S., in which case it's not doing all this stuff, or it is doing all this stuff. But you can't have it both ways, right? So make up your minds, folks. In my opinion, the U.S. is a conquered nation, and we are suffering in thraldom under the heel of some alien ideology that our military is helpless against completely. in fact, has suckered into. And so that makes the problem even harder to deal with, doesn't it? So I write on here, Dems blame pubs, pubs blame Dems, while in the meantime the country has gone down the drain. Think you can get it back with party politics? Think again, I suggest, right? It's not within the framework of political parties that you're going to be able to rescue this USA that you think so highly of. And if you're in the military and you notice that no one's teaching American history, whose military are you in then, really? Good question. Talk to you soon.